Well, hello once again to everyone. This is Danny here on behalf of all the elders at the Church of Christ in Pilgrim with our weekly opportunity for reflection and discernment, or WORD as an acronym. This is for Wednesday, August the 16th, 2023. Now, for those of you who are members of our church family at Pilgrim, you're probably very aware of the emphasis our leadership has placed this year upon three basic expectations that we're requesting from each member. One is to know, two is to grow, three is to go. Now, know means to be in God's Word daily with your personal study time. Grow means to be part of a small group regularly to encourage and to be encouraged. And go means to serve in a ministry or mission passionately to increase God's kingdom here on earth. It is my hope that these series of video devotionals over the years have helped encourage you to either undertake these three areas of spiritual growth or to continue growing in them from day to day. Several years ago, our adult education ministry, in conjunction with the church's leadership and staff, created a Wednesday night Bible study program entitled Peak of the Week. The basis of the title lay in our desire to assist, to motivate, and to encourage our members to stop in the middle of their week to take a break from the stresses of work, of school, of caregiving, just of life's daily struggles, and to spend some time together in Bible study designed to refuel each other spiritually. By doing so, it was, and still is, hoped that this time of study and fellowship would be seen by its participants as the spiritual peak of the time spent between our regular Sunday worship services. We're currently in the middle of our 2023 summer series for Peak of the Week, in which each week's study is being facilitated by a different individual. Each volunteer has been tasked with simply discussing one of their favorite Bible verses or passages, chapters, books, etc. I have agreed to speak Wednesday night, August 16th, and I thought that I would use this week's devotional time to do a dry run of the material that I plan to present. The passage that I have chosen to be my focus is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. Now, if you are familiar with that particular chapter, you'll remember that it documents the occasion when Jesus used three different parables involving three different scenarios to teach his followers about being lost spiritually. In particular, I will be referencing the third of Jesus' three parables, one that's typically known as the parable of the prodigal son. To say that this is one of my favorite passages, favorite parables, would be an understatement for sure. Years ago, Sherry and I, along with several others, wrote and acted out a Bible story room on this subject for each night of Vacation Bible School. Then, a few years after that, we had a Peak of the Week series in which attendees were asked to participate in learning and reciting some scripture from memory, and I chose this parable for my recitation. Some of you may even recall that I've already used this parable as the subject matter of previous devotional videos. In December of 2020, one entitled The Prodigal Son, Done Wrong Times 3. In August of 2021, The Pattern of the Prodigal. And in September of 2022, Lost in Luke. Once each year since we began these video studies during the COVID pandemic of 2020. So today, I'll be simply continuing that streak for this year. I'll begin by reading the passage. Now, because it is quite likely a very familiar story to us, I wanted to use a translation that would be one of the less familiar ones used in someone's personal study. And I hope that how it is rendered by this new translation entitled The Voice will bring freshness to our hearing of this familiar lesson. So here it is from Luke 15, verses 11 through 32. Once there was this man who had two sons. One day, the younger son came to his father and said, "Father, eventually I'm going to inherit my share of your estate. Rather than waiting until you die, I want you to give me my share now." And so the father liquidated assets and divided them. A few days passed, and this younger son gathered all his wealth and set off on a journey to a distant land. Once there, he wasted everything he owned on wild living. He was broke. A terrible famine struck that land, and he felt desperately hungry and in need. He got a job with one of the locals, who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. The young man felt so miserably hungry that he wished he could eat the slop the pigs were eating. Nobody gave him anything. So he had this moment of self-reflection. What am I doing here? Back home, my father's hired servants have plenty of food. Why am I here starving to death? I'll get up and return to my father, and I'll say, Father, I have done wrong against God and against you. I have forfeited any right to be treated like your son, but I'm wondering if you'll treat me as one of your hired servants. So he got up and returned to his father. The father looked off in the distance and saw the young man returning. He felt compassion for his son and ran out to him, enfolded him in an embrace, and kissed him. The son said, Father, I have done a terrible wrong in God's sight and in your sight. I forfeited any right to be treated as your son. But the father turned to his servants and said, Quick, bring the robe we have and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Go get the fattest calf and butcher it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, because my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and has been found. So they had this huge party. Now the man's older son was still out in the fields working. He came home at the end of the day and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant said, Your brother has returned, and your father has butchered the fattest calf to celebrate his safe return. The older brother got really angry and refused to come inside, so his father came out and pleaded with him to join the celebration. But he argued back, Listen, all these years I've worked hard for you. I've never disobeyed one of your orders. But how many times have you even given me a little goat to roast for a party with my friends? Not once. This is not fair. So this son of yours comes, this wasteful delinquent who has spent your hard-earned wealth on loose women, and what do? You butcher the fattest calf from our herd. The father replied, My son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. Isn't it right to join in the celebration and be happy? This is your brother we're talking about. He was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found again. Okay, for the remainder of our time together today, I'll be reviewing the parable from two perspectives. First, from its cultural setting, and secondly, from its spiritual application. So first, the cultural setting. Now, when the younger of the two sons appealed for, quote, my share of your estate, end quote, we should remember the custom of the times involving paternal inheritance. First, in Deuteronomy 21:17, we're told that the older son would be due a double portion, as his birthright from being the firstborn, or 2/3 of the full value. The younger of the two sons would thus be due 1/3 of the full value, even though there were only two sons. In addition, an additional factor was the custom that should a father's estate be divided among his heirs while he still lived, it would only consist of any movable items. This would then negate any land and structure values otherwise due to the younger son, thus significantly reducing the total value of what he received. An interesting takeaway from this introduction to the younger son is an implied perception on his part that his father would be of more value to him dead than he currently is while alive. Verse 3 strikes me as such a powerful passage. It concisely packs a whirlwind of events into a minimum of words. Did the younger son waste any time? Quote, a few days passed, end quote. Did he feel fully equipped to tackle the changes life now held in store? Quote, he gathered all his wealth, end quote. Did he give thought to the state of the father and the older son who were being left behind? Quote, he set off on a journey to a distant land, end quote. Did he show wisdom in managing his father's hard-earned assets? Quote, once there, he wasted everything he owned on wild living. He was broke, end quote. Now, when a famine struck where the young son now lived, quote, he felt desperately hungry and in need, end quote. I checked the various translations in my Bible app, and they characterize the famine as bad, great, mighty, severe, terrible, violent. Now, I thought it was interesting that, of course, with my OCD, fringe OCD, when I put those words down, I put them in alphabetical order, but also as I read through them, it seems that they go from a milder designation to a more violent designation. Bad, great, mighty, severe, terrible, violent. He no longer had a loving father and a home life as a safety net in hard times with the means to protect him from such a situation. And one wonders if this might have been the first time ever for him to experience a lack of necessities. When faced with death, the younger son resorted to taking a menial position of feeding a farmer's pigs. Imagine the severe blow to his self-esteem, finding himself so near, or perhaps actually at, the very bottom of the community's social ladder. If one assumes that Jesus and his audience would visualize the family in this scenario as being Jewish and his new locale as being among the Gentiles, then the job taken by the younger son was doubly humiliating, as it called for him to provide for animals considered to be unclean, which belonged to a people considered to be outcasts. With verse 16, Jesus completes his verbal description of how far the younger son had fallen in strikingly terse language. Quote, the young man felt so miserably hungry, end quote. In fact, so much so that, quote, he wished he could eat the slop the pigs were eating, unquote. Sadly, however, quote, nobody gave him anything, end quote. Verses 17 and 19 of Jesus' story present us with a pivot point in both the younger son's mood and his actions. The school of hard knocks certainly had an effect upon him, for we find his perspective making a 180-degree change. Quote, he had this moment of self-reflection, end quote. In evaluating his current state, he was struck by an ironic truth. Quote, back home, my father's hired servants have plenty of food, end quote. And yet here he was, quote, starving to death, end quote. You can almost hear the despair and the desperation in his plaintive cry to himself, quote, what am I doing here, end quote. Earlier, before reaching this pivot point, the younger son had thought and acted rashly and selfishly. But now, after facing his pivot point, the younger son thinks and acts more maturely and selflessly. He vowed to himself that he would leave the pig pen and return to his father. He would own his sin, not only against his father, but against the Lord as well. He would accept his forfeiture of any future inheritance rights, and he would ask his father to accept him back in a hired servant's role. Imagine the contrast between the attitude and the demeanor of the younger son. First, there was his arrogant departure from the family and the home. Now there is his pitiable return. This return brings Jesus' audience, brings us a series of interesting twists. Scripture says this, quote, the father looked off in the distance and saw the young man returning. He felt compassion for his son and ran out to him, enfolded him in an embrace, and kissed him, end quote. This tells me that loving father was already looking for the younger son's return, most probably, on a daily basis. The first response we are given for the father is that of compassion. The original Greek depicts this as to be moved in the inward parts, and long viewed as the root of all of one's affections. Now, we must not miss the significance of the phrase telling us that the father, quote, ran out to him, end quote. There was a custom at this time to address a son who had left home and yet had returned after losing his inheritance to Gentiles. He would face the threat of his father initiating a kizaza ceremony, which was designed to publicly shame him among the people in the community. But in order to run to greet the returning son, the father would have to hike up his tunic, which was considered to be a shameful act when done publicly. Through this reception, therefore, the father took upon himself the shame that was rightly due to his son. With all this in mind, doesn't this elevate within our minds the intensity expressed when the father, quote, enfolded him in an embrace and kissed him, end quote. A comparison of the son's confession to his father at his return in verse 21 with his intended statement decided upon earlier from verses 18 and 19 will reveal that the loving, welcoming father never gave him the chance to ask to be a hired servant. Notice the components of the father's planned welcome reception. First, there was a robe. No doubt this would be one of elaborate and elegant design, and it would normally have been reserved for use by one deemed to be a special guest of the family by its patriarch. Then there was a ring. Typically, this signified that the wearer was deemed to bear a measure of authority within the family. We also have the sandals, an outward indication that the wearer was a free man and by no means a servant of any rank. Then we have the fatted calf, often provided at feast by the host with the expectation that it would be sufficient to feed the entire community. The father's justification for all of the above: let's have a feast and celebrate because my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and has been found. Whenever I read these words, I hear within my mind his voice cracking with emotion. This brings us to a second pivot point in our story, which involves the older son who remained behind all the time the younger son had been away. The older son had missed the actual return of the younger son, having been working in the fields, but he heard a commotion as he approached the house at the end of his workday. And when he learned that the reason for it all was, quote, when he learned the reason for it all, he, quote, got really angry and refused to come inside, end quote. Earlier, the father had left the house to run and welcome his returning younger son. Now the father is again called to leave the house to welcome his angry older son to the celebration. In both instances, we see a loving father's response to a rebellious attitude, albeit expressed differently by each of the sons. There are some points of interest in the older son's reply to his father. First, he says, I've never disobeyed one of your orders. At the very least, this statement might be partially true, but certainly not entirely. He referred to the returning one as, quote, this son of yours, end quote, refusing to even acknowledge him as a brother. Finally, he made the accusation, quote, this wasteful delinquent has spent your hard-earned wealth on loose women, end quote, when there's no indication at all that he could have known any details of his brother's time away. His objections are summed up in the ultimate complaint of children toward their parents in all situations, in any era of history, when he said, quote, this is not fair, end quote. Our story closes with the father's response to his angry older son. He says, my son, you are always with me, and all I have is yours. Again, when reading this, I hear it in my mind rendered in a soft and tender tone toward this upset child. The father acknowledges the older son's time spent at home. The father also reminds the older son that any and all inheritance at his death is now destined to pass to the older son alone. The father also asks the older son, quote, isn't it right to join in the celebration and be happy? This is your brother we're talking about, end quote. Note how the father lovingly corrects the older son's early derogatory reference of, quote, this son of yours, end quote. The father then repeats to the older son what he had earlier told the servants about the son who had returned. Quote, he was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found again, end quote. With this final statement, the loving, compassionate, forgiving father confirmed that he deemed the return of his lost son to be of more value to him than any loss he might have caused by his leaving. Whew! That turned out to be quite a lengthy study of the cultural setting. Now allow me to close our study with a brief overview of the parable's spiritual application. It's my contention that this particular parable paints for us one of the most revealing verbal pictures of God and how he responds to the decisions we make, the actions we take, even the rebellion that we at times express. The father of the parable, of course, strikes me as a picture of God himself. The younger son strikes me as a picture of one who chooses to rebel against what he or she might perceive as a constraining situation, convinced that his or her personal desires and intentions would no doubt be more welcomed and enjoyed. The older son strikes me as a picture of one who outwardly presents a facade of faithfulness and yet inwardly harbors a sense of resentment and disappointment over God's mercy for others as compared to his or her ill-perceived expectations of deserving much more in contrast. We see depicted with the younger son one who acts foolishly, pays the consequences of his poor choices, and eventually learns lessons of humility and respect, which motivates him to return to a loving God. We see depicted in the older son one who acts obediently, demonstrates respect, and yet shows his foolish side by whining over God's mercy, at least when it is extended to those whom he or she judges as being unworthy. But permeating the fabric of the whole story is the Father's spiritual presence and provision. He accepts the younger son's selfish and disrespectful demands, yet never fails in his desire for the prodigal's return to the fold. When that return occurs, his love is expressed through his compassionate welcome and acceptance. No further punishment or humiliation is considered, and the father mercifully accepts the shame rightfully due to the willful and wasteful son. The father at the same time acknowledges the older son's turn from faithfulness and respect to self-serving pity and spite. However, he lovingly reminds the son of his continued sheltered and blessed status. He refuses to vindicate the son's attitude of accusation and non-acceptance of the younger one who has returned in humility. And he underscores the fact that both individuals are still viewed by him as his children within his loving kingdom. Well, I hope that you have found another return to the parable of the prodigal son to have been an interesting, encouraging, and even challenging study today. Next week, we'll look at another subject, and whether it's to be another single standalone lesson like today's, or if it's to be the first of another series, it's yet to be determined. But regardless of which path we find ourselves traveling, I hope you'll be able to join in viewing it once it's been posted online. Until then, I encourage you to make it a regular practice to make time every day to spend time in prayer to the Father and to take time to study His Word. If you are currently attending Bible study, if you are not currently attending Bible study or worship somewhere, I would invite you to visit us at the Church of Christ in Pilgrim. I can promise you a warm welcome, along with the opportunity to get to know and grow spiritually with a loving body of baptized believers in God, His Son, and His Spirit. So until then, I pray that God may bless you and your family each day. And please remember, I love you all. Goodbye.